Here we're going to demonstrate the basic use of an API in a C# ASP.NET MVC core application. And so we're going to start first by creating a new project. And under the .NET Core, ASP.NET Core Web App, and we're just going to call this application. Let's call it API simple, and just going to say OK to that. We're not going to add this to our Git repository. Okay, I've got .NET Core 2.2. You may have a different version. I'm just going to use my latest, and we're going to use this web application model view controller template. I'm going to uncheck configure HTTPS. We're going to leave authentication to no and say OK. And there we go. Over here on the right, you can see we have our models, our views, and our controller folders. For this example, we're really only going to do a couple of things. We're going to create a model to work with our data, and we're going to modify the home controller and the index view. So here's kind of the sets of what we're going to do. And so first we're going to create the model to work with the API data. We're going to call that our EF models CS. We're going to modify our home controller, and we're also going to modify the index view. Okay, so when we modify our home controller, we're going to add lines to connect to the HTTP client. We'll go over all of this. We're going to create a home constructor for the home controller. We're going to get data from the API using the HTTP client request, which will be a JSON string. You'll see how we do that. We're going to parse that string, and we're going to store that data into a list, and then we're going to get data from that list and pass it to the index view. Of course, we'll be modifying the index view to receive that data. So let's begin. The very first thing you want to do is you want to examine the endpoint. So here I'm working with this IEX trading API. And so you could be using any API, but you just need to look at the API documentation to get a couple of pieces of information. First of all, to get to my API, I need to know where is the endpoint. So this is ref-data/symbols, and that will be appended to the base URL to get to the API. We'll look at that in a minute. The other thing you should look at is what does the data look like on the other end, so at the endpoint. So this is an example of what the JSON string would look like. Here it has several fields and then gives you example of what those data might look like in the JSON string. So you read the documentation on the API, and the very first thing on the programming side that you want to do is you want to create the model to work with the data. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click and add new, and I'm going to choose class, and I'm going to call this my EF models. EF stands for entity framework. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call mine EF model _ models.cs. I'm going to add that. Okay, so I've already got an example project that I've worked out, and I'm just going to grab my code from my EF models. I have a very simple right here. a very simple class that I'm calling the company. And let's look at that here. And I'm not really using any directives in this example because the only thing that I'm using my model for is to work with the data that's passed from the API. And all this application is going to do is just simply display the data. So if we look here, I created a class in my model called company. And if you look here, the data that I added to my model, if you examine the API, we have symbol, name, date, type, IEX ID, and I also grabbed this is enabled right here column. So if you look at our data, that matches up, and I just made appropriate choices of the data type based on what I've observed here in the sample output right here from the JSON string. Okay, so that's all we do there. The model, again, going back to our steps. So we create the model to work with the data. Done. So now we need to modify the home controller. So let's open up our home controller. By the way, as you go along, it's a good idea just to build your project to make sure you haven't had any syntax errors. So let's open up the home controller and let's see what we're going to do here. Okay, going back to our steps, we're going to add some lines to connect to our API using an HTTP client. So essentially what we're going to be doing in this application is we connect to the endpoint where the API path is, and the expected response, we're going to make an HTTP client request, sort of like the way that a browser makes a request to a web page. So we would be requesting to the API. If you were to look at that screen, you would see a JSON string in the URL. So we need an HTTP client to do that. And so in C#, this is what that looks like. And I'm going to grab my code that I've written for this example first. And here's what we've got. So if we look here at what we're doing first, is we've got this base URL, and we're going to look at that here in a minute. And then we've got our HTTP client. Now notice that that is underlined here, a curly red underlining, because that means that we're missing a directive. So we've got a couple of directives that we want to add for this example. We're going to, since we said what we're going to be doing is using an HTTP client and we're going to be parsing a JSON string, we're going to use these two directives. Okay, so system.net.http right there. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up here. And to show you an example of what the string is going to look like, I'm going to move ahead just a little bit here. And we'll see if we come here to our endpoint. I want to show you what the endpoint looks like. So here we go. So we're just going to add on the end of this URL. And notice this is a really long JSON string. So this is indicated here when we look at, so my browser has parsed that JSON string. When we look at the documentation, that's what this is talking about here on this endpoint. And this is an example of what the data looks like. So I just want you to understand that when we're making a request to this endpoint, an HTTP client request, we get back this string. So you can imagine what we're going to have to do programmatically is we're going to have to parse this string in order to store it in a list and work with the data. In this case, in this application, this simple application, we're just going to display it in a web page. Okay, let's go back to our code. So let's go back to our steps. So now that we've added the lines to connect to the API, and we're going to use our HTTP client, we have to create a constructor in the home for the home controller that creates an instance of our HTTP client. So right now, we're going to create a new instance of our HTTP client. And I've got some code ready to go here. Look at that. Here's our constructor for our home controller. There we go. And here we're creating a new instance of our HTTP client. And right here, these are just some initial settings that we set for our client. Specifically in the header of our HTTP request, we want to specify that we're working with JSON right here. Okay, so that's an important piece when we make an HTTP request. We want to specify our header. Okay, great. What's next? Now we're going to get the data from the API using the HTTP client request, parse that JSON string, and then store our data in a list. Okay, so how do we do that? Right here, we're going to create this get symbols method because the API that we're using right here is the symbols API from the IEX trading. Okay, so we just call it symbols because it makes sense for naming convention. So let's go over here and let's get the code that I've written and let's take a look here. Okay. All right, let's see what we got here. So first of all, this is the name of our method getSymbols, and we expect to return a list that complies here with our data model. Remember, our data model is company. Remember, we created this data model here, and this is what we expect the data to comply with this structure here. So we expect that our list complies with this structure. We're going to return a list in this method. It's a return method. And all we're doing here is we provide the base URL and then we add the specific endpoint to the symbols API. Remember, we got that from our documentation here. Okay. All right. We're going to have first, we have to get that really long string that's returned from the HTTP client request. And we're going to store it in this variable here called company list. So it'll just be a really long continuous string. And then we're going to create an instance of our list that complies with the schema we created in our model here, our company model. And we're going to set that to null, so it'll be empty. So we've got two pieces of data we're going to work with. We've got a string, and then we're going to put it in the form of a list because we have to parse that string. Okay. Next, we're going to use our HTTP client to make a request to the entire path, and then we're going to get the response from the HTTP client from that path. We're going to get the result from that response. Okay. And once we've got that, we store that in our response and we work with it. Okay, so the very first thing we need to do with that really long string is we have to parse all of the JSON in it. And so we take that response, that long string, and right here, okay, and we are going to read that and parse it. And as you see here with our parser, what we do with JSON is we deserialize the object, right here, and we assign it to our list, right there, our string, okay, and it goes into our list. So you see that? Remember up here we've got the company list is the string, and companies is the actual list. Two different kinds of objects. Okay, so we take that company list string, we take the JSON, parse it out, and we put it right here inside of that list. And we're only getting the first 50 from the response back from the HTTP client request on the JSON string. We're only getting the first 50. That's what that 0 through 50 means. Okay. So the very last thing that we're going to do is we're going to get the data. Now that we have it in a list, we're going to get it and we're going to pass it to our index view. So really not much exciting there. We have our index view here, and this is all we're getting. Let's just get this code. Okay, so this is the default code put in by the index view from the template, and all we did was here is, in order to run this, when the controller first gets executed and it tries to render the index view, we want that method there to run the get symbols. And remember, that's the one we just created, this get symbols. So that will return a list, right? This method returns a list. And we now have that list in this variable right here called companies. So we're going to pass the response from get symbols as a list and send it right here to the view. And again, we're working with the index view. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to modify our default index view so that we can look at this information. Okay, so if we come right here to our views and we go to home, we've got this index view, and this is what it looks like by default. In my template, it just displays a welcome page. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change this code. We're going to get rid of it, and we're going to view our data, and I'll show you what it looks like. So all I did was create an HTML table, and we added some razor code in there. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, so let's look at what we did. First things first, this should be the name of your, so this is API simple. So the only thing that we did here in our index view, this was already in there, that's nothing exciting. All we did here was we right here have a reference to model, where we know that in our API simple is the name of our project. In our models, we have available to us the company model. And remember here, here's our company class. Okay. And so since that is the exchange with the list, we can enumerate through it. We can iterate through the data that's responded from the API from an HTTP client request. And we can do that right here. Let me show you. So all this is no big deal. This is just an HTML table. And all we've done here is some table row headers where we have symbol, name, date, and type. I'm only grabbing 4 fields from the data that we have returned. And in the body of the table, here's our iterative statement where we can iterate through our model. And so it's just a loop that says for each item in the model, okay, here is the symbol, the name, the date, and the type returned underneath each one of those appropriate column headers, and just provide the data underneath each of those. And that's it. That's all we have here. So I'm just going to build my solution to make sure I don't have any syntax errors. And hopefully we have a build succeed. And we did. And let's just see, let's run our application. If everything was done correctly, we will see a web page displayed with a response from the API. And there we have it. So right here, all of this data that you're seeing is a response from the API. This is the first 50 rows. Response returned from an HTTP client request, the API. This is the symbol, the name, the date, and the type. So this concludes, and it's a very simple example of how to get an HTTP client request to an API using an MVC ASP.NET Core web application and a simple display inside of a web page from an API.